Usually when we talk about a diagnosis, whether it's a medical thing or, I don't know, a mechanical issue, there is this expectation of absolute precision.
Right, yeah, like it should be black and white.
Exactly. I mean, you break your arm, you go to the hospital, and the x-ray shows that jagged, undeniable white line. The doctor just points at the film and says, there it is, that's the fracture. Or if your car breaks down.
The mechanic just plugs into the diagnostic port and gets an error code.
Yeah, exactly. You get an exact code. It's binary, it's observable, categorizable, and honestly, it's incredibly comforting. We like our problems to be visible so that the solutions can just be, well, straightforward.
We want the easy fix.
Right. But what happens when you try to take an x-ray of modern masculinity? You step into this world of sociology and institutional history and gender dynamics, and suddenly that diagnostic machine is just completely broken.
It really is. I mean, we are looking at a landscape of modern society that is incredibly murky right now.
It's so murky, it feels like everyone senses a fracture in the foundation somewhere, but no one can actually agree on where it is or even what caused it in the first place.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. And, depending on what lens you look through, you will see a completely different underlying disease.
Which is exactly why today's deep dive is going to be something truly singular. We are doing an exclusive, ultra-long, incisive, and I think a totally fascinating exploration of a newly released, highly explosive ebook.
Yeah, this one it's heavy.
It really is. It is titled The Soy Curtain, How Woke Ideology Replaced the Iron Curtain, and it's by Conrad Riker. Now, before we go literally any further, stop what you were doing right now, hit that like button, and subscribe to the channel.
Definitely do that. You do not want to miss a single minute of what we are unpacking today.
Seriously. If you are part of the men's rights activist audience, or, if you consider yourself a red-pilled manosphere man, this deep dive is custom tailored for you. The text we are looking at maps out the specific history of our institutions. It looks at exactly how they operated and thrived
Before they were captured?
Right, before, as the author forcefully argues, they were captured by feminists and cultural Marxists.
It is a sweeping architectural review of modern civilization. I mean, Riker looks at literally everything, from dating apps to the Pentagon, and he does it through a very specific, highly uncompromising lens.
He does not hold back. And if you want to truly understand the hidden architecture of modern society that Riker is exposing here, you need to buy this ebook right now. It is available on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
And you absolutely need to follow the author. That's at Conrad Riker on Substack for his uncut daily analysis. Yep, at Conrad Nesreich on Substack. Go do that. So our mission today is to thoroughly and logically break down Riker's arguments across evolutionary biology, corporate culture, family courts, and the modern dating collapse. But before we get into the weeds of the staggering data he presents, we really need to set the ground rules for how we are navigating this text.
Yes, a crucial disclaimer is absolutely necessary here, because this source material contains highly politically charged content.
Highly charged.
Yeah, it aggressively addresses both left-wing and right-wing paradigms. So our approach today is going to be one of impartial reporting. We will not be taking sides, nor are we endorsing the viewpoints, the politics, or the conclusions drawn by the author.
We are just the messengers today.
Exactly. Our role today is to act purely as neutral guides. We are here to convey the exact ideas, the specific statistics, and the structural arguments contained in Riker's original source material. The goal is for you, the listener, to fully understand the framework he has built. Perfect. I think that's clear. So let's start at the foundation. Before Riker analyzes how any specific institution supposedly fell, he establishes a baseline premise. He frames this entire text around an epic, ongoing clash between evolutionary biology and social engineering.
It's the core of his whole argument.
Right. And he does this by introducing the metaphor of the title, the shift from the Iron Curtain to the Soy Curtain. How is he defining that transition?
Well, it's a really striking historical metaphor. Riker describes the Iron Curtain of the Soviet era as an apparatus of physical oppression.
Like actual walls.
Exactly. It was highly visible. We're talking barbed wire, concrete walls, armed guards, physical shackles. If you tried to cross it, you were shot.
Right.
But he argues that the Iron Curtain has fallen, only to be replaced by the Soy Curtain, which he describes as a suffocating global ideological fog.
An ideological fog. So it's not enforced by guards in watchtowers.
No, not at all. It is enforced by shame, by human resources departments, by social media algorithms, and by cultural ostracization. Riker argues this new curtain is a system engineered by cultural Marxists to specifically enforce weakness, compliance, and, well, male submission.
So the punishment is different.
Yeah, you don't get shot for crossing the soy curtain. You get canceled, fired, or divorced.
Wow. And the absolute core of this ideological fog, according to the book, is the modern progressive concept of gender equality. Riker doesn't just critique gender equality as a policy failure. He asserts that it is a literal biological impossibility.
He goes straight for the biology.
He really does. He argues that we are pretending men and women are interchangeable blank slates. And he brings heavy academic receipts to back this up, starting with evolutionary psychologist David Buss and his massive 37 culture study.
Yes, Buss's research is foundational to Riker's entire worldview. If you aren't familiar with it, David Buss conducted a sprawling cross-cultural study spanning 37 different societies globally.
That is a huge sample size.
We are talking about over 10,000 participants. And what makes this study so robust is that it didn't just look at Western industrialized nations. It looked at capitalist societies, socialist societies, agrarian cultures, polygamous cultures, and monogamous cultures.
So it completely eliminates the argument that, this is just how Western capitalism conditions people to act.
Precisely. The methodology was specifically designed to strip away cultural conditioning and find the biological bedrock of human mating strategies. And what Buss found was that universally, across all 37 cultures, 89% of women,
Wait, 89%?
89%, and in some specific cultural metrics, up to 97% of women prioritize resources and status in their mates above physical attractiveness.
89 and 97%. I mean, that is not a marginal preference. That is a biological mandate at that point.
It is. It's the biological concept of hypergamy, which is the instinct to mate across and up the social hierarchy. Riker spends a lot of time unpacking the why behind this.
Right, because it's not just arbitrary.
Exactly. Evolutionarily speaking, female reproduction is incredibly costly. A woman faces a 9-month gestation period, followed by years of vulnerable lactation and child rearing. During the ancestral environment, a woman who mated with a low-status male who couldn't provide food or physical protection was essentially ensuring the death of her offspring.
So it was literal life or death.
Yes. Therefore, Riker argues, women are evolutionarily hardwired to seek providers and protectors. It is a survival mechanism that no amount of modern social conditioning, corporate seminars, or progressive legislation can erase.
Meanwhile, he looks at the flip side of the coin. If women are wired to select for status and resources, what are men wired for? Well, Riker argues that men are biologically built for endurance, risk-taking, and protection to acquire those resources. And he points to ancient history here, specifically the Spartan Agaj.
Oh yeah, the Agaj. That was the rigorous education and training program mandated for all male Spartan citizens.
Right, where they took the kids away.
Yeah, boys were taken from their mothers at age 7 to be forged through immense hardship and competition into elite warriors.
Right, and Riker isn't just giving a history lesson here. He draws a direct, unbroken psychological line from that ancient drive to survive the Agaj, straight into the modern corporate boardroom. He notes that men currently account for 93% of Fortune 500 CEOs.
Which is a massive disparity.
Massive. Now, the progressive argument is that this 93% figure is the result of a systemic patriarchal bias holding women back, but Riker completely rejects that.
He does. He argues that this disparity isn't due to systemic bias or, an old boys club. He attributes it to an inherent, highly competitive, hyper-focused biological drive.
Like an obsession.
Exactly. To become a Fortune 500 CEO requires a level of obsessive, single-minded dedication that often destroys work-life balance, physical health, and personal relationships. Riker argues that testosterone provides the neurochemical fuel required to sustain that level of aggressive competition, whereas female biology, broadly speaking, prioritizes a more balanced, socially cohesive existence.
So the text essentially says that modern society is currently attempting to legislate away 200,000 years of human evolution.
That's the core conflict.
Right. When our modern institutions look at natural male strength, which he defines as the drive to compete, to conquer, to protect, and to lead, and they label that strength as toxic masculinity, Riker says they are engaging in outright biological denialism.
He argues that testosterone is the literal rocket fuel of civilization. It is what built the bridges, fought the wars, and pushed humanity into the industrial age. To treat it as a pathology to be cured or a behavior to be medicated away is a fatal error in his view.
And he grounds this theoretical argument in a very famous, very real-world example, the James Damore Google memo. If you're listening and you don't remember this, Damore was an engineer at Google who wrote an internal memo a few years back.
I remember when that broke. It was everywhere.
It was huge. He cited peer-reviewed evolutionary psychology about the biological sex differences between men and women, specifically regarding things like spatial reasoning versus empathy, and how those biological differences naturally result in different career preferences in the tech industry.
Yeah, Damore was essentially arguing that the lack of a 50-50 gender parity in coding wasn't necessarily due to sexism at Google. He said it was due to differing biological interests at the population level. Men, on average, are more interested in systems and things, while women, on average, are more interested in people.
And the outcome of that memo is what Riker points to as the ultimate, undeniable proof of the Soy Curtain in action. Because Damore didn't write a hateful rant. He wrote a heavily cited, scientifically grounded argument, yet he was fired within hours.
And this is where Riker hones in on the mechanism of institutional capture. According to Riker's analysis of the event, Google's human resources termination process essentially admitted that the scientific facts Damore presented were largely correct.
Wait, they admitted he was right.
Yeah, they admitted the data was accurate, but they fired him anyway. The stated reason was for perpetuating gender stereotypes.
Okay, I want to make sure I'm following the logic here. Riker is saying that the corporation acknowledged the data was scientifically accurate, but because the data made people feel emotionally uncomfortable, the data itself was deemed a fireable offense.
Exactly. Riker views this as a massive, terrifying shift in the architecture of society. He argues that when established, peer-reviewed evolutionary psychology becomes a fireable offense in a corporate setting, you are no longer operating in a merit-based workplace. You have entered an ideological re-education camp.
That is wild. The ideology cannot survive the sunlight of biological reality, so the system simply silences the messenger. Damore is the canary in the coal mine for corporate America, deciding that biological facts are subordinate to ideological conformity.
It really sets the stage for the rest of his argument.
It does, which brings up a really complex dynamic, because it feels like what Riker is describing throughout this line is a state of Schrodinger's masculinity.
Schrodinger's masculinity. I love that term.
Right. Help me unpack this ultimate double bind. On one hand, society constantly tells men they need to be vulnerable, that the old ways of stoicism are toxic and that they need to open up. But Riker argues that the second a man actually shows weakness, he is immediately discarded.
Yep.
Yet if he shows his natural biological strength and competitiveness, he is labeled a dangerous threat to the workplace, like James Damore. How does a man survive a game where every single move he makes is penalized?
Under the framework of the Soy Curtain, he doesn't. Or rather, he absolutely cannot win if he plays by the rules the system provides. Riker explicitly states that there is no escape hatch offered to man by this progressive system. Only submission.
Just submission.
Right. Schrodinger's masculinity perfectly captures the trap. Show emotional pain and you are deemed pathetic. Bottle it up and remain stoic and you are labeled emotionally distant, toxic, and cold. You are simultaneously required to be a harmless pacifist and a capable protector, which is biologically contradictory.
So if this double bind is breaking men in the public sphere, in the workplace and in the culture at large, what happens when these same men take that profound psychological exhaustion into their private lives? If the foundation of how men interact with the world is fractured, what does that do to the living room?
That perfectly transitions into Riker's analysis of the private sphere. Because when Schrodinger's masculinity is applied to romantic relationships and the mating market, the results are, in his words, catastrophic. He refers to this as the vulnerability trap.
Let's dive deeply into this vulnerability trap, because this directly challenges a lot of mainstream advice. Riker argues that the modern cultural demand for men to open up to their partners and be emotionally vulnerable is not just misguided, it is a massive deception.
A total trap.
Yeah, and to prove this, he doesn't just use anecdotes. He cites a highly specific longitudinal study from UCLA.
This study is a linchpin in his argument about romantic dynamics. The UCLA researchers tracked married couples over an extended period. They were looking at emotional expression and marital satisfaction. And the data they uncovered is fascinating.
Okay, lay it on me.
They found that wives rated their husbands 27% less attractive within 24 hours of witnessing them have an emotional breakdown or display significant vulnerability.
Wait, I really want to linger on this because it's staggering. 27% less attractive in just 24 hours. How is that even measured? Are these women consciously saying, I saw him cry, now I don't love him?
It's not necessarily a conscious, malicious choice on the part of the women, and that's a crucial distinction Riker makes. The study measured self-reported feelings of sexual attraction, respect, and overall romantic satisfaction.
Okay.
So Riker uses this to argue that human biology simply does not care about what a modern couples therapist might recommend. A woman might consciously, intellectually believe she wants a vulnerable, emotionally expressive man. She might even demand it.
Right, because culture tells her to.
Exactly. But her evolutionary wiring, that ancient software that kept her ancestors alive, responds to male weakness with an immediate visceral loss of respect and physical attraction.
Because, evolutionarily speaking, a weak man, a man who breaks down under pressure, cannot protect the tribe when the proverbial saber-toothed tiger attacks.
Precisely. If he's crying on the couch because work was stressful, the biological alarm bells in the female subconscious start ringing, signaling that this mate cannot handle the rigors of survival.
So, if you take that biological reality, that women are evolutionarily wired for hypergamy and demand strength, and you crash it into progressive social engineering that tells men to be soft and vulnerable, you get the total collapse of the modern dating market.
And he has a great name for it.
He does. Raker cleverly coins this collapse as sexonomics. Let's look at the digital data he pulls to illustrate sexonomics, because it completely defies standard statistics. He looks at Tinder's internal data scrapes.
The swipe data.
Yeah, Tinder data shows that women swipe right, meaning they express interest on only the top 4.5% to roughly 20% of men on the platform. That leaves a staggering 80% of men completely invisible.
Invisible. Just gone.
And it's not just Tinder. He cites OkCupid data showing that women rate 80% of men on the app as below average in attractiveness. Now, I'm struggling with math here. A standard bell curve dictates that most people are average. How is Riker explaining the statistical impossibility where 80% of the population is deemed below average? Is this just algorithmic manipulation by the apps to force men to buy premium features, or is it pure psychology?
It is a combination, but Riker leans heavily into the evolutionary psychology aspect. He argues that while it doesn't make mathematical sense in a modern egalitarian framework, it makes perfect evolutionary sense under the framework of female hypergamy.
How so?
Because women are biologically driven to seek the absolute highest status provider, they filter ruthlessly. Think about it.
Yeah.
Before the internet, a woman's mating pool was limited to her village, her church, or her college campus. She had to select the best man from a localized group.
Right, a smaller pool.
But dating apps have hypercharged this instinct by creating a globalized, digitized mating market. Now, a woman in a mid-sized town isn't just comparing local men to each other, she is comparing them to the top 1% of men globally who are projecting wealth, status, and peak physical fitness right on her phone screen.
So the apps act as an accelerant for hypergamy. It artificially inflates the baseline of what is considered average.
Yes. And Reika points out the deep cultural hypocrisy that shields this dynamic from criticism. Modern culture enthusiastically encourages women to have incredibly high standards, to demand a high-earning, 6'5" alpha provider who goes to therapy. We call that knowing her worth.
Sure, empowerment.
But if a man expresses a biological preference for youth, physical fitness, or submissiveness in a partner, he is immediately publicly shamed, labeled superficial, and accused of toxicity.
Okay, so if the math is that brutal, if 80% of men are essentially locked out of the mating market because they don't meet this digitally hyperinflated standard, what happens to them? They don't just vanish.
Actually, Riker observes that they are opting out entirely. He points to the massive international rise of MGTOW, that's men going their own way. And he looks at the phenomenon of herbivore men in Japan as the ultimate case study of this future.
Herbivore men.
Yeah, in Japan currently, 42% of men under the age of 30 identify as virgins. And consequently, the national birth rate has plummeted to 1.26, which is well below the replacement level of 2.1.
42% of men under 30. That is a civilization-ending statistic right there.
It is. Riker argues that these men are not broken, nor are they incapable. Rather, they are making a highly rational, calculated economic decision. They look at the sexonomics of the modern world and realize the game is rigged against them.
So they just walk away.
Why should they participate in a system where the risks, which include devastating alimony, the potential for false accusations, and the emotional destruction of the vulnerability trap, so heavily outweigh the biological rewards?
Yeah.
They are simply going on strike.
He makes a really provocative historical argument here, too. He says that feminism sold the dismantling of traditional socially enforced monogamy as progress and liberation. But by removing the social structures that paired one man with one woman, we aren't evolving. We are actually reverting to a primal hunter-gatherer state.
Yes, he refers to it as the Cheesecake Factory effect of modern dating.
Ha! Cheesecake Factory effect.
Yeah, in a primal state, a tiny fraction of top-tier, hyper-aggressive men monopolize the reproductive access. Riker refers to these top-tier men using the internet vernacular, chads. He argues that without the civilizing enforcement of monogamy, the sexual marketplace resorts to this brutal, primitive system where a few chads rotate through vast harems of women.
Well, everyone else gets nothing.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the vast majority of beta males, the 80% who are swiped left on are essentially expected to sit on the sidelines, bankroll dates for women who will ultimately choose the chad, and pay heavy taxes to support a societal infrastructure that completely ignores their genetic and emotional needs.
To bring this vulnerability trap into sharp modern focus, there is a very specific pop culture anecdote he brings up that I found totally fascinating. He talks about a recent Super Bowl commercial that featured a famous NFL linebacker.
Yes, the commercial where the linebacker was on camera, crying openly about the pain of his recent divorce. It was framed as this beautiful moment of male emotional honesty.
Right. The advertising agency clearly thought they were hitting a home run for progressive masculinity. But Riker tracks the social media analytics immediately after that commercial aired. That NFL linebacker, a peak physical specimen, a millionaire athlete, lost 34% of his female Instagram followers within 48 hours of crying on national television.
Wow. He is the perfect scalable illustration of the UCLA study we discussed earlier, playing out in real time in front of millions of people.
In just 48 hours.
Yeah. The culture, the advertising executives, and the media told this man it was brave and attractive to cry. But female biological attraction responded with immediate, measurable revulsion.
If you are listening to this, you might be thinking, wait, I've seen plenty of male CEOs or celebrities who cry or go to therapy, and they seem highly successful with women. But Riker's counter to that, based on his framework, is that those men are succeeding in spite of their tears because they have overwhelming wealth and status to compensate. Whereas an average guy who cries just becomes instantly invisible.
The average guy doesn't have $1 billion to soften the blow.
Exactly. It feels like modern dating app algorithms have become a digital sweatshop for men's self-esteem. They are working endlessly, swiping right, paying for profile boosts, enduring rejection, just to get a microscopic fraction of attention from a system fundamentally designed to extract their financial resources while ignoring their humanity.
It's a bleak picture.
It is. So I have to ask, if women's biological wiring makes them universally crave strength and stoicism, why does the modern progressive culture push so incredibly hard for men to act like emotional therapists? What is the goal of the social engineering if it doesn't even make women happy?
That is the central question Riker tries to answer. And his conclusion is that it is fundamentally about institutional control.
Control.
He argues that independent, stoic, emotionally self-reliant, and physically strong men are incredibly difficult for a bureaucratic, administrative state to control. A man who relies on himself doesn't need the state.
That makes sense.
By pathologizing natural male strength as toxic, and by encouraging emotional fragility, the system aims to create a population of compliant, easily managed citizens. If you break down male self-reliance, you create a populace that is deeply reliant on state intervention, on pharmaceutical solutions, and on corporate HR departments to mediate every aspect of their lives.
Wow. Okay, so if the private sphere is governed by this brutal biological filtering, and men are being psychologically exhausted at home, what happens when those same biological imperatives are forced to wear a suit and tie in the institutional world?
That's where things get structural.
Exactly. This brings us to the next massive pillar of the book, segment 3, castration, capitalism, and the factory of feminine failure. Let's start at the very beginning of the institutional pipeline, which is education. Riker claims that merit has been entirely replaced by woke conformity, and he says the indoctrination starts in elementary school.
He points out a stark demographic reality here. 87% of elementary school teachers are women. And because of this overwhelming female dominance in the classroom environment, Riker argues that natural high-energy boyish behavior is immediately misunderstood and pathologized.
The text goes really deep into the ADHD epidemic here.
Exactly. He notes that boys are prescribed powerful stimulants like Ritalin at 5 times the rate of girls for exhibiting identical, naturally active behaviors.
Let's look at the mechanism of this. How does this actually happen in practice?
Riker argues that the modern educational system is designed around a female baseline of behavior, sitting perfectly still for 8 hours, quiet compliance, conflict avoidance, and collaborative group work. These are traits that, on average, young girls adapt to more easily.
Right.
Young boys, fueled by natural testosterone spikes, require physical exertion, rough and tumble play, and competitive outlets. But because the teaching staff is 87% female, they view this male energy not as a different learning style, but as a medical defect.
It's treated as a disease.
Yes. So instead of giving boys more recess or hands-on learning, the system literally medicates boys to force them to conform to a feminine standard of compliance. The results of this pipeline are undeniable. Male college dropout rates are now 30% higher than female dropout rates. The education system is actively filtering boys out.
And when those boys do manage to survive the Ritalin pipeline and make it to a university campus, they step into what Riker describes as an absolute legal minefield. He spends a significant amount of time analyzing Title IX ex-tribunals on college campuses.
This is a major point of contention in the book.
It is. Now, Title IX was originally created to ensure equal funding for female sports. But Riker notes that it has been weaponized into an administrative judicial system that operates on a preponderance of evidence standard. Walk us through the legal mechanics of that, because it's honestly terrifying.
Well, in a traditional court of law, to convict someone of a crime, you need evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. That implies a 95 to 99% certainty of guilt.
Standard due process.
Right. But on college campuses, Title IX tribunals dealing with sexual misconduct allegations operate on a preponderance of evidence. Legally, that means it is more likely than not that the event occurred. It is essentially a 50.1% likelihood of guilt. A coin toss.
A coin toss to ruin a young man's entire life.
Yes. Riker calls these tribunals kangaroo courts. He heavily cites the infamous Duke lacrosse case, where male athletes had their reputations, their academic careers, and nearly their lives ruined by completely false accusations.
I remember that. It was a media circus.
It was. And the institutional system pushed forward with the persecution, ignoring exculpatory evidence, because the burden of proof had been lowered so drastically to satisfy feminist political agendas. Riker argues that due process, a foundational pillar of Western civilization, has been entirely canceled for men on college campuses.
And it absolutely doesn't stop at graduation. These young men survive the campus tribunals and enter corporate America, which Riker scathingly labels castration capitalism.
Castration capitalism.
This is where mandatory sensitivity training, microaggression policing, and diversity, equity, and inclusion quotas reign supreme over actual engineering merit. And he uses a chilling high-stakes example here, the Boeing 737 MX crashes. Riker draws a direct line between corporate diversity initiatives and this catastrophic engineering failure.
It is one of his most controversial claims. Riker notes that during the investigation of the crashes, it was revealed that an inexperienced pilot with only 200 flight hours was in the seat during a critical failure. The traditional industry standard for commercial pilots is 1,500 hours of flight time.
200 versus 1,500. I have to play devil's advocate here to test Riker's material. Couldn't a critic argue that prioritizing different cognitive approaches through diversity actually provides a stronger safety net? Or, more cynically, couldn't putting a 200-hour pilot in the seat just be standard corporate greed and cost-cutting by an airline? How does Riker specifically link this to a diversity initiative?
It's a fair question. Riker's argument is that the cultural shift within the corporations enabled the cost-cutting to be masked as progress. He cites internal memos and hiring directives from the aviation industry that explicitly prioritize gender and racial parity in hiring pipelines over strict, merit-based, hours-flown competence.
Ah, I see.
He argues that when an HR department's primary directive is to fulfill a diversity quota, the rigorous, uncompromising standards required for high-stakes engineering and aviation are inevitably compromised. As he puts it, when ideology trumps engineering merit, planes fall from the sky. Gravity doesn't care about your inclusion seminar.
Gravity doesn't care. That's a brutal line. He also looks at the tech industry, specifically the push for what is called algorithmic equity. This is something we all interact with daily. This is where code is literally written to force inclusive language onto the user.
Like autocorrect?
Yeah, like your iPhone auto-correcting fireman to firefighter, or Microsoft Word flagging the word chairman as problematic and suggesting chairperson. But behind the scenes of this sanitized tech environment, Riker points to a specific set of MIT data analyzing GitHub, the massive code-sharing platform.
This is a fascinating data point that challenges the core assumption of the diversity industry. The MIT analysis looked at team performance on GitHub. The data showed that all male coding teams solved complex algorithmic problems 40% faster than mixed gender teams.
40% faster. That is a massive differential in productivity.
It is. And Riker uses this to argue a very specific point. When men are allowed to associate freely and focus purely on the mission and the merit of the work, without the constant friction of inclusive HR policing and communication protocols, their natural competitive drive produces vastly superior results.
You just called it HR policing, but Riker coins a brilliant term for it. He calls it the estrogen empathy penalty. Let's look at the mechanism behind this. How does this penalty actually function in a modern office?
Well, Riker roots the estrogen empathy penalty in neurochemistry, specifically looking at oxytocin. Oxytocin is a hormone heavily involved in female bonding, childbirth, and social cohesion. It functionally changes human group dynamics to prioritize consensus, emotional safety, and harmony over conflict and risk.
Okay, so it's biologically driven harmony.
Yes, exactly. Riker argues that modern HR departments, which are overwhelmingly female-dominated, are essentially institutional structures optimized for oxytocin. Because they prioritize consensus and avoiding hurt feelings, they inherently penalize the testosterone-driven behaviors, aggressive debate, risk-taking, blunt criticism, and hyper-competitiveness that are actually required for rapid innovation.
So they punish the builders.
Yes. He notes that while male-dominated high-testosterone fields build literal infrastructure, power grids, skyscrapers, deep-sea cables, and the Internet Gender Studies departments produce zero patents.
Zero patents. There is a story in the text that perfectly encapsulates this estrogen empathy penalty in action. The story of Jim Barnes, the Detroit auto worker.
Oh, that story is a microcosm of the entire book.
Yeah?
Security cameras in a Detroit factory caught Barnes tackling an armed robber who had entered the facility. Barnes actively physically subdued the threat, saving his female co-workers from potential extreme harm or death.
By any traditional historical standard, Jim Barnes is a hero. I mean, give the man a medal.
Absolutely. But corporate management fired him.
Fired him for saving lives.
The official reason given was for engaging in unapproved violence and violating the company's strict zero-tolerance policy on physical altercations. His union representative noted that the company executives privately admitted Barnes was heroic, but the HR policy, which was designed to mitigate all forms of aggression, dictated mandatory termination.
Unbelievable. They want lions until the lions roar. The system demands male physical protection when a predator enters the room, but the moment the threat is neutralized, the system penalizes the exact biological aggression required to execute that protection.
It's that double bind again.
It is. It's like taking the structural logic of a skyscraper. Think about the massive load-bearing steel pillars in the lobby of a high-rise. They are rigid, they are uncompromising, and they take up a lot of space. Now imagine a new building management team comes in and says, these steel pillars are too aggressive. They don't make the lobby feel welcoming or inclusive. Let's replace them with something softer, maybe some decorative drywall.
Right, because it looks nicer.
Exactly. You can make the lobby look however you want, but the second a storm hits, the ceiling is going to crack and the building will collapse. Riker is arguing that traditional masculinity is the load-bearing pillar of civilization. So my question to you, the expert. If Riker cites Harvard Business Review data showing that male-led teams outperform diverse teams by 22% in high-stakes fields, how do these captured corporations survive in a free market? Shouldn't a competitor just crush them?
It's a great point. Riker's argument is that these captured corporations aren't truly surviving on current merit. They are coasting on the massive momentum of the infrastructure built by the patriarchs of the past.
They're running on fumes.
Exactly. They are spending the cultural, structural, and financial capital amassed by generations of uncompromising male-driven innovation. But he warns that this momentum is finite. When a society prioritizes emotional safety over output and merit, it is engaging in a slow-motion civilizational collapse.
And that collapse is perhaps most vivid, most personal, and most destructive when we move from the boardroom to the courtroom. Because when the builder's foundation is cracked at work, what happens to the legal contract of his marriage?
That's where things get really bleak.
It does. This brings us to a devastating section of the book, gynocentric injustice and feminism's body count. Riker identifies the family courts not as a place of mediation, but as the ultimate state-sanctioned weapon of male destruction.
The statistics he compiles in this chapter are meant to paint a picture of systemic, state-sponsored extraction. He starts by looking at the initiation of divorce. Riker cites data showing that women initiate between 70% and 90%, of all divorces in Western nations.
70 to 90%. So the dissolution of the family is overwhelmingly driven by one side. And when they do initiate, how do the courts respond?
The courts heavily favor the initiator. Family courts award mothers primary custody of the children in 80% to 92% of contested cases. Furthermore, men pay 97% of all alimony nationwide.
97%.
Yeah. And the economic impact on the individual man is devastating. A man's post-divorce standard of living and disposable income drops by 25% to 40%, while the woman's standard of living, subsidized by child support and alimony, actually rises.
But the financial extraction is only part of the nightmare. Riker also brings up the Duluth model regarding domestic disputes. We touched on this earlier, but I really need you to unpack this with a hypothetical scenario.
Okay, shoot.
Let's say a husband and wife get into a heated argument. The wife picks up a ceramic plate and throws it at the husband's head, cutting him. He's bleeding. He calls the police for help. When the cops arrive, under the framework of the Duluth model, what physically happens?
Under the strict application of the Duluth model, the police are trained through a feminist sociological lens that views domestic violence not as an individual conflict, but as a systemic expression of patriarchal control. The model inherently assumes that the male is the primary aggressor, using power and control over the female.
Even if he's the one bleeding.
Yes. So in your hypothetical, even though the husband called the police, and even though he's the one physically bleeding from the plate, the police are trained to view her action as self-defense against his systemic patriarchal control. The model dictates a mandatory arrest policy that overwhelmingly targets the male.
That's insane.
Riker claims this framework results in men being arrested in 72% of domestic disputes, completely, regardless of the physical evidence or who initiated the violence at the scene.
The man calls for help, and the state arrests him. It is pure Kafka. And what is the tragic endpoint of all this legal, financial, and emotional disenfranchisement?
The body count. Riker points to the staggering suicide rates among men. Divorced men commit suicide at 3.5 to 10 times the rate of women.
10 times.
Yeah. He extends this globally, too, pointing out that men account for 78% of all suicides worldwide. And in terms of physical sacrifice, men account for 93% of all workplace fatalities.
Huh. This is where Riker develops his theory of the divorce industrial complex and what he provocatively calls state-sponsored cuckoldry. Let's look at the mechanisms here. He argues that the legal system actively, financially, incentivizes women to break their families apart.
Exactly. If a woman is unhappy or simply feels her hypergamous instincts are no longer satisfied, the state acts as her enforcer. She knows she will likely win the assets, she will win primary custody of the children, she will keep the marital home, and the man will be forced by threat of imprisonment to continue funding her lifestyle.
She gets the house, he gets the bill.
The man is reduced to what Riker bluntly calls an ATM with testicles.
He illustrates the systemic cruelty with the horrific anecdote of John the plumber. John is a guy who spent 20 backbreaking years building a $2.3 million estate and a highly successful local plumbing business. His ex-wife filed for divorce and deplored false abuse claims during the proceedings.
The standard playbook, according to Riker.
Right. Even though those claims were eventually dismissed by a judge due to lack of evidence, the grueling family court process, the legal fees, and the temporary asset freezes bled him completely dry. John lost the business he built. He lost the house he paid for. He now literally lives in his work van while his ex-wife uses his Tesla, which he bought, to drive to Pilates classes with her new, younger yoga instructor boyfriend.
And for Riker, the tragedy of John the plumber is not that he is a rare anomaly.
Right.
The tragedy is that he is the intended, optimized result of the system. The court successfully extracted the spoils of John's labor and awarded them to the ex-wife, legally validating her hypergamy while utterly destroying the builder.
When you lay out the mechanics like that, it sounds exactly like a hostile corporate takeover. In the business world, a hostile takeover involves aggressive, calculated legal maneuvers to seize control of a company's assets against the will of the founders who built it. Riker is essentially saying the modern marriage contract is a hostile corporate takeover of a man's life, and the state-family court system acts as the notary public facilitating the theft.
That is a very accurate reading of his economic lens on marriage. The state is the muscle that enforces the hostile takeover.
So if society fundamentally runs on what Riker calls the male disposability doctrine, the unwritten rule that society expects men to die on oil rigs, fall off roofs, framing houses, and work 80-hour weeks in dangerous conditions to fund the tax base, What happens when men collectively realize the marriage contract is void and just go on strike?
That is the exact systemic threat Riker is diagnosing with the MGTOW movement. If the disposable, high-torque engines of society refuse to turn the gears because the fuel has been siphoned off, the entire infrastructure collapses. But Riker takes the argument even deeper. He argues that the attack on the male engine isn't just legal and cultural, it is literal, chemical, and biological.
Which transitions us perfectly into the most dystopian section of the book. Because if the legal extraction isn't enough, Riker argues there is a literal physiological war being waged. We are talking about the war on the male body and the environment. Let's look at the medical data he brings forward, because it is alarming.
He points to the staggering, well-documented global drop in male fertility. Since 1973, average global sperm counts have plummeted by an astonishing 59.3%.
Almost 60%.
Yes. Additionally, average serum testosterone levels in men have been dropping by roughly 1% annually since 1982. A 30-year-old man today has significantly less testosterone than his grandfather did at the exact same age.
Let me push back here, though. Nobody denies the data on sperm counts dropping. But is this deliberate social engineering, or is it just the tragic, unintended industrial byproduct of modern manufacturing?
Riker argues that while it began as an industrial byproduct, the progressive establishment has actively embraced and promoted the mechanisms causing the decline. He blames environmental factors heavily pushed by progressive lifestyles, widespread endocrine disruptors, microplastics saturating the water supply, and specifically the aggressive cultural push for plant-based and soy-heavy diets.
Aha, the soy connection.
Right. Riker cites nutritional studies showing that strict vegan diets, lacking in essential animal fats and high in phytoestrogens, can lower free testosterone by up to 60%. He argues that the relentless media and corporate push for sustainable soy-based diets is functioning as chemical castration. The goal, he asserts, is to make the male population docile, low energy, and compliant.
And if you chemically sterilize the male population, how does a society reproduce? Riker points to the terrifying rise of transhumanism to answer that. He notes that billions of dollars in venture capital and government funding are currently being invested in artificial womb technology. He specifically names DARPA's Project Womb Warrior, an initiative exploring the boundaries of lab-grown gestation.
Yes, the intersection of commercial surrogacy, genetic editing, and artificial wombs. Riker claims this technology is the ultimate progressive Trojan horse. The end goal of the elite, he argues, is to completely erase the biological family unit. If the state or corporations can mass-produce human beings in artificial incubation pods, you render the biological role of the protective father entirely obsolete. You replace the nuclear family, which is a pocket of resistance to state control, with state-owned and corporate-managed reproduction.
It's pure Brave New World, and he links this biological engineering directly to modern environmentalism. Riker frames the entire climate activism movement as a thinly veiled, direct attack on masculinity. He says that the campaigns to ban gas stoves, the regulations targeting diesel trucks, and the climate initiatives trying to ban red meat consumption aren't actually about saving the ozone layer. They are targeted strikes on male-coded independence, tradition, and vitality.
He calls it castration theater. Riker points out the massive, glaring hypocrisy embedded in the movement. You have climate activists gluing their hands to major highways, explicitly blocking working-class plumbers, electricians, and tradesmen from getting to their jobs.
Right, hurting the working man.
Meanwhile, the progressive political elites and billionaires pushing these exact policies are flying to climate summits in fleets of private, carbon-spewing jets.
He explicitly mentions the visual contrast of Leonardo DiCaprio's massive, diesel-burning super yacht emissions compared to a working-class guy just trying to drive his F-150 to a job site. Or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife data showing that green wind turbines kill hundreds of thousands of birds and bats every single year, yet the activists completely ignore the ecological damage because it doesn't fit the anti-fossil fuel narrative.
Riker's point is that environmentalism has ceased to be a scientific endeavor and has become a secular religion. And like many ancient religions, it demands sacrifices. But the sacrifices it demands are always the tools, the diets, the vehicles, and the livelihoods of traditional working-class men.
Let's look at the mechanism of this grand strategy. It sounds exactly like the sci-fi concept of terraforming. You know, like when an alien species arrives on a planet and terraforms the atmosphere, changing the oxygen levels and the climate so that the native species die off and only the aliens can breathe. Is Riker suggesting that the progressive movement is essentially trying to terraform the Earth chemically with microplastics, culturally with HR departments, and environmentally with regulations to make the planet hospitable only to compliant, low-testosterone citizens.
That is precisely his thesis. He believes the environment is being actively, maliciously engineered to be hostile to natural male biology. And once the biology and the family unit are compromised by this terraforming, Riker argues, the system moves to dismantle the final remaining fortresses of male strength.
Which brings us to the next phase of the collapse. With the body compromised, where do men retreat? Riker maps out how the last three bastions of traditional masculinity sports, the military, and religion have been systematically captured. Let's start with sports.
Riker points again to the weaponization of Title IX. A law that was originally explicitly designed to protect female athletics and ensure women had a fair space to compete is now being used to force biological females to compete against biological males who identify as transgender.
The Leah Thomas case.
Exactly. He cites the high-profile case of Leah Thomas, a biological male who transitioned and subsequently dominated women's collegiate swimming. Riker calls this dynamic misogyny dressed as progress the ultimate sanctioned erasure of women's physical achievements to validate male psychological identity.
Then he moves to the military in a chapter he provocatively titles Estrogenizing the Eagles.
He details how the Pentagon has compromised merit for inclusion. He points to the 2013 force integration policy under the Obama administration, detailing how combat physical fitness standards were quietly lowered or modified to ensure female recruits could pass.
Lowering standards for combat readiness.
Yes. Furthermore, he points out that elite, historically ruthless military academies like West Point are now mandating healthy masculinity seminars for cadets. The institution is actively pathologizing the exact aggressive, hyper-competitive, kill or be killed traits that are biologically required for ground combat.
And the contrast he draws with the rest of the world is chilling. While American generals are teaching 19-year-old cadets about microaggressions and pronoun usage, he notes that China's People's Liberation Army is actively promoting specialized, testosterone-boosting drills designed to physically and psychologically harden their young men.
A total divergence in strategy.
Completely. And he looks at the invasion of Ukraine. When the Russian tanks rolled across the border, Ukraine immediately locked the borders and strictly enforced male-only conscription. They didn't draft the women because, as Riker bluntly puts it, bullets don't care about pronouns.
It proves his point about biological reality. When the illusion of safety is shattered and survival is actually on the line, societies instantly abandon social engineering and revert to biological reality. They send the men to die.
Finally, he looks at the bastion of religion. He notes that mainline Protestant churches, the denominations that have most aggressively shifted to female pastors and swapped out traditional patriarchal language like Father, Son, and Holy Ghost for inclusive, neutered terms like creator, redeemer, sustainer, have hemorrhaged members. He cites a loss of 26 million members from these progressive denominations since the year 2000.
Riker synthesizes all of this institutional decay in sports, the military, and the church under a concept he calls the Atlas penalty.
The Atlas penalty. Explain the mechanics of that.
Well, men are the ones who originally built these massive institutions. They laid the stones of the churches, they fought the wars to establish the military, they created the sporting leagues. Like Atlas from Greek mythology, they carry the weight of the structure.
Right.
But when men are forced by modern culture to adapt these institutions to accommodate inclusive feminine leadership styles, which prioritize emotional consensus over absolute truth or victory, the institutions inevitably lose their masculine core. When a church stops preaching rigorous moral standards and becomes a glorified therapy session, men simply walk away.
They just abandon it.
Exactly. Riker notes the demographic proof of this. While progressive, inclusive churches bleed millions of members, male-led, strictly patriarchal Orthodox Jewish yeshivas and traditional Islamic mosques are absolutely thriving, retaining their young men and outbreeding their progressive counterparts.
There is a statistic he uses that perfectly encapsulates this Atlas penalty and the inherent hypocrisy of the system. He cites FEMA reports analyzing disaster response fatalities. The data shows that men comprise 96% of all firefighting fatalities. 96%. When the building is burning, men rush in and die. Yet the military academies and university sociology departments are simultaneously telling young men that these hypermasculine, protective, risk-taking traits are a psychological disease that needs to be cured.
It is the ultimate paradox of the modern world. Society relies entirely on male sacrifice and male disposability to survive natural disasters, build infrastructure, and fight wars. Yet it actively vilifies the exact biological hormones and psychological traits that make that sacrifice possible.
This feels like a concept I'd call architectural Darwinism. Riker mentions the tragic visual of Notre Dame Cathedral, the pinnacle of Western religious architecture burning down, and he contrasts it with Dubai currently building massive 1,300-foot minarets in the desert. Is Riker ultimately suggesting that societies that abandon patriarchy are inevitably conquered or simply outpopulated and replaced by cultures that strictly enforce it?
Yes, he views history through a deeply uncompromising evolutionary lens. He argues that matriarchies and hyper-egalitarian societies always collapse historically because they fail to harness male competitive drive for defense and infrastructure. The cultures that survive, expand, and conquer are the ones that honor, structure, and channel male aggression toward building rather than trying to medicate it out of existence.
So we have reached the climax of the book. If the institutions are completely captured, the corporate HR departments, the family courts, the schools, the military, and even the air we breathe, what is a red-pilled man supposed to do? Lay down and give up. This brings us to Riker's battle plan for solutions and rebuilding, the Phoenix Imperative.
It is vitally important to note that Riker does not advocate for political reform. He does not tell his readers to go out and vote harder or to try and reform the current HR department.
Well, more voting.
Right. He believes the system is too deeply infected and too far gone to be saved from within. His strategy is entirely about starving the beast and building robust parallel structures.
She starts with what he calls financial armor, because if they can't access your money, they can't control you.
Exactly. He instructs men to aggressively use cryptocurrency, specifically Bitcoin and Ethereum, to completely bypass woke banking institutions that might freeze assets based on political wrongthink. He advises utilizing complex offshore accounts and trusts to shield assets from the extraction of the family courts we discussed earlier.
Preemptive defense.
And if a man absolutely insists on getting married, Riker demands the use of what he calls MRA prenups, ironclad legal contracts explicitly designed to void all alimony payouts if false abuse claims are made during a divorce.
He also tackles the education of the next generation. He tells fathers to pull their children out of public schools immediately, labeling the public system as state-run indoctrination factories.
He advocates for rigorous homeschooling, specifically utilizing classical curricula. He wants boys taught about the great patriarchs, the Roman emperors, and the inventors who built civilization. For community, since the traditional town square is compromised, he urges men to intentionally join and fund exclusively male spaces to rebuild physical brotherhood and stoicism.
Like gym spaces.
Yeah, he points to Brazilian jiu-jitsu gyms, firearms training nonprofits, and male-only trade and agricultural communes as the new foundries for masculinity.
Legally and culturally, he proposes some highly aggressive, asymmetric tactics. He talks about using due process jiu-jitsu. This means heavily funding aggressive countersuits against Title IX kangaroo courts, aiming to bankrupt the universities with legal fees when they violate a man's rights. He even advocates for the controversial practice of jury nullification, where jurors refuse to convict a man under a law they deem unjust to stop the Duluth model at the trial level.
He's going on the offensive legally.
Culturally, he preaches a radical return to physical sovereignty. Intense weightlifting, heavy meat-based diets to actively counteract the phytoestrogens and boost testosterone, and the practice of unapologetic, rock-solid stoicism.
This is the core engine of the Phoenix Imperative. Riker points out a massive, fatal economic vulnerability in the current progressive system. Men currently pay roughly 82% of all federal net income tax.
82%.
The sprawling administrative state, the diversity programs, the massive welfare systems, they all inherently require high-earning male labor to fund them. Riker wants men to legally minimize their tax footprint, drop out of the corporate grind, build independent digital off-grid cabins, and form physical, self-sustaining enclaves.
He highlights a real-world example of this strategy already in motion, the Free State Project up in New Hampshire. He describes thousands of libertarian, red-pilled men intentionally moving to a single geographical area. They are bartering skills directly, a master mechanic fixing a dentist's truck in exchange for a root canal. They are running untaxed cash or crypto businesses and completely bypassing the institutional matrix.
They're essentially forming a localized parallel economy. They're starving the federal parasite by removing their resources from the host body.
So here is my final critical question for you to analyze, looking at the entirety of Riker's plan. He is essentially telling millions of highly capable men to act like a decentralized insurgency. He's telling the builders to take their tools, hide their money in the blockchain, and go home to their cabins. But if the men who literally build the bridges, write the code, and maintain the physical infrastructure actually do that at scale, does the system eventually feel the pain, self-correct, and realize it needs to respect men again? Or does the system simply collapse into absolute Mad Max-style chaos?
Riker's text heavily implies that a catastrophic collapse is not only inevitable, but necessary. He believes the current system is a parasite that has grown too large for the host of male labor to support. If the host intentionally cuts off the nutrient supply, the taxes, the corporate compliance, the physical labor, the parasite dies. Whether what eventually emerges from the ashes is a beautifully restored merit-based patriarchy or violent, chaotic tribalism is a risk he seems entirely willing to take. Because he views the current status quo, the Soy Curtain, as a slow, humiliating, agonizing extinction for men anyway.
Wow. Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. We have just taken an intense, totally unfiltered journey through Conrad Riker's The Soy Curtain. For our men's rights and red-pilled listeners, understanding this specific, highly detailed framework from the biological baseline of hypergamy in the Damore Memo to the vulnerability trap of modern dating, the oxytocin-driven castration of corporate capitalism, the weaponization of the family courts, the chemical terraforming of testosterone, and finally the Phoenix imperative to build parallel crypto economies. This is absolutely vital for decoding how Riker believes our institutions were systematically captured.
It is a comprehensive, aggressively argued architecture of societal collapse, ending with a detailed manifesto for male separatism and self-sovereignty.
I want to firmly remind everyone listening right now, like and subscribe to the channel. You need to go immediately to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books to buy your copy of The Soy Curtain. Read the studies, look at the data, and trace the history for yourself. And make sure to follow the author at Conrad Traeger on Substack for his uncut daily analysis. We promise you an uncompromising exploration of the hidden architecture of modern society, and we've walked through the blueprints room by room. But I want to leave you with one final lingering question to turn over in your mind. Riker repeatedly invokes the concept of the Atlas complex, this profound idea that men are the ones silently carrying the weight of the physical world on their shoulders. If Riker's diagnosis is right, if the men who keep the massive power grids online, who pump the fresh water into the cities, who die on the oil rigs, and who build the literal steel infrastructure of civilization collectively decide to put down their tools, hide their money, and walk away, what happens to a society that has entirely forgotten how to build itself? Think about that the next time you turn on a light switch.